Unmute. Reclaim your voice after growing up as the scapegoat to a narcissistic parent. I'm going to start with a case example today. Alicia was in her second year working at her local hospital as a social worker. Once a month, the staff gathered together for presentations on new developments in the field. Today, an older social worker who was billed as an expert in the field was presenting on how to best treat clients with post-traumatic stress disorder. And this was Alicia's wheelhouse. She read everything she could get her hands on about trauma and its treatment. As the woman explained the symptoms of PTSD, Alicia grew more and more excited. She remembered how useful that she had found a grounding exercise to be with her clients who numbed themselves in order to cope with their PTSD symptoms. The grounding exercise she used was to ask her clients to notice what is in their immediate environment with all five of their senses. And eventually, this shift in their attention would bring them back to the present moment. Well, to Alicia's surprise, the presenter did not mention anything about such grounding exercises. Alicia felt herself surging inward to speak up and let her colleagues know about the effectiveness of these techniques with this client population. Simultaneously, another part of her insisted that she stay silent. This part was convinced that something terrible would happen if she spoke up. These were the thoughts that raced through her mind. Do I even know what I'm talking about? There must be a reason this woman did not talk about grounding exercises. Maybe I'd sound like an idiot if I brought them up. Oh, but I really want to tell them about how well this works with my clients. But I would probably offend this lady if I say anything. She'll think I'm saying that she doesn't know what she's talking about, and then I'd be in real trouble. Well, Alicia was gripped by her instinct to speak up and frozen by her reflex to mute herself. Are you wondering why the prospect of sharing her knowledge seemed so dangerous to Alicia? She clearly had something of value to share with her colleagues, yet she feared that the presenter could experience her as challenging their authority. In Alicia's world, she owed complete deference to people in authority, or she'd have to face their wrath. Getting by meant muting her own thoughts and feelings so that others did not feel challenged by her. And here's how I know this. Well, in my own life's journey, it's included time spent as the scapegoat in my family of origin. And at the time, I was not aware that I was being targeted. I believed I was too selfish, inconsiderate, and irresponsible for my parent to react to me in any other way than the scornful and contemptuous way that she did. Despite not knowing that I was the scapegoat when it was happening, I had to contend with beliefs that I was defective and undeserving. In fact, my time in graduate school was supposed to end with a PhD in clinical psychology. But looking back, these beliefs made that end result feel too dangerous to make happen. But looking back, these beliefs made that end result feel too psychologically dangerous to make happen. And I'll explain why later. So I left with my master's degree and went to work as a statistician in a completely different field for about 10 years. But in the meantime, I got myself into therapy. And with the help of my therapist's presence, empathy, and respect, we grew to understand together that my parent had forced me to feel worthless so that she did not have to. At first, this made a lot of intellectual sense, and I was driven to learn all that I could about the psychological pathology that could lead a parent to treat their child this way. Despite having freed my mind to know that I had been mistreated by this parent, it was far more difficult to live in ways that defied this narrative. Knowing and living from my strengths felt unsettling, foreign, and dangerous. Evaluating whether certain friends or partners added to or subtracted from my life felt intensely disloyal. And setting boundaries with people in positions of authority remained terrifying. So just like Alicia, I had learned that muting myself was the only way to stay safe, and that lesson had yet to be unlearned. But I was not going to stop with what my therapist and I had started until I could unlearn it. Along the way of this journey, it became safer and safer to live at a higher volume. That happened through participating in this ongoing relationship with a therapist who kept responding to my efforts to live like I was adequate and deserving with continued support and presence. I kept learning that if I stepped closer to being who I sort of really was that there was no longer the danger of losing someone that I needed. A big part of unmuting for me was returning to the field of psychology. This meant finding a way to leverage the master's degree in clinical psychology I had gotten 10 years prior and to parlay that into a license to practice therapy today. So for 3 years, I worked as an intern therapist in California on nights and weekends to make this happen. Most of my clients during this time sought therapy because they thought that they were the problem in their lives. They tended to take more than their fair share of responsibility for problems in relationships, at work, and at home. Then I noticed that many of them had people in their lives who demanded this of them. Whether it was a partner, a friend, or a boss, they would mute themselves around these people. What proved helpful with these clients was to explore and challenge their sense that they had no other option but to stay muted today. As I worked with more and more clients who survived childhood with a narcissistic parent, another feature emerged. Many of my clients and myself had narcissistic parents who would go out of their way to devalue, deprive, and domineer them. I had to understand and learn about what happens when narcissistic abuse takes this extreme form. And this led me to the concept of scapegoating. Making a child into a scapegoat allows a narcissistic parent to avoid feelings of worthlessness that they cannot stand in themselves. As I reflected on how my parent would seize on any and every opportunity to find fault with me, the role of scapegoat really seemed to fit my story too. Such parents bolstered themselves in the only way possible at great expense to their scapegoat children. So my professional course was set. The problem for us who survived narcissistic parents as the scapegoat was that we had to mute ourselves. Over time, staying muted became associated with being safe in the world. Unmuting ourselves carried grave felt danger and would shut down our attempts at doing so. I knew from my own journey that the only way for it to feel gradually safer to unmute would be through experience in new relationships where the other person welcomed our voice. Unmuting just cannot be done alone. My role as therapist to other scapegoat survivors would be to accompany and support them as they tried to unmute themselves. Well, the habit of muting yourself may be a solution to a long-standing problem. When a parent is pathologically narcissistic, they cannot offer their child a receptive audience. Pathological narcissists suffer a core sense of worthlessness, which they deny and then relocate to the people around them. This maneuver allows them to insist that they are worth more than others and that these worthless others owe it to them to treat them as such. Pathologically narcissistic parents expect their child to provide them with a good audience. So the narcissistic parent does not want to hear from the child, but they may also get the child to think of themselves as worthless. And again, this is the process known as scapegoating. Now the scapegoat child must force themselves to live a false identity of being defective and undeserving. The narcissistic parent helps them do this by providing a steady diet of what I'll call the 3 Ds: devaluation, deprivation, and domineering. Since the scapegoat child needs a relationship with the parent more than the parent needs a relationship with the child, the parent has the advantage. The child must find a way to put up with the parent's mistreatment. So the child's solution is to mute their need to have an audience for what they need, think, and feel. This ensures survival, but can lead to a grim quality of life marked by feeling unimportant and offensive to others. In today's video, I'm going to explain the psychological makeup of a narcissistic parent. Then I'll describe how that makeup divides the family into allies and enemies. The child put into the role of enemy becomes the family scapegoat. And I'll share how the parent forces this child to think, feel, and act as though they are in fact worthless. You will learn how the scapegoat child survives this abuse by muting themselves. Next, I'll address why scapegoat survivors are motivated to unmute themselves. And finally, I'm going to explain the processes to put in place in your life today to successfully unmute yourself. The psychological makeup of a narcissistic parent. Well, if you're watching this video, then perhaps you were raised by a narcissistic parent. To understand how and why you had to mute yourself as a child, I think it's important we understand the psychology of such parents. Children of narcissistic parents are dependent on an adult who is not equipped to meet their needs. These parents struggle with unbearable feelings of worthlessness. And to cope, they claim that they are superior and deny what they actually feel about themselves. They do this by dividing the people in their lives into allies and enemies. Allies are perceived as having similar high status to the parent. Admiring or being admired by allies promotes the parent's sense of superiority. Enemies are perceived to be lower status and serve to embody the worthless characteristics that the narcissistic parent cannot stand in themselves. In families headed by a narcissistic parent, members are assigned roles based on who is an ally versus an enemy to that parent. Often a spouse and selected children are coerced into being the narcissistic parent's allies. The parent forces these people to show them nothing but admiration and agreement, or else. The allies are spared direct hostility so long as they comply. But if they deviate from this mutual admiration society, they could face the parent's retaliation, rejection, and/or withdrawal. These allies know what lies in wait for them if they do not keep showing allegiance to the narcissistic parent, because they see how the parent treats the unfortunate child selected to be the parent's enemy. Well, let's go back to Alicia. As with all of my therapy clients, I asked her what it was like for her in her household as a kid. Who did she feel closest to? Who, if anyone, presented problems for her? What was it like when mom or dad got angry? And so Alicia described a childhood where she felt like the constant adversary to her family. Her mother seemed to have it out for her. Whatever Alicia wanted was opposed. If she asked to go play with her friend next door, her mother would accuse her of being selfish. If Alicia was absorbed in a book and did not look up when her mother walked into the room, then she was being disrespectful and did not care about her mother. Alicia learned that if she paid attention to what she wanted, that she would either hurt or be hurt by her mother. She described how her younger sister, named Sarah, did not get the same treatment. Sarah was held very closely to her mother at all times. Her mother expected Sarah to accompany her on her day-long shopping trips and to do so with a smile. Sarah learned very early that Alicia made her mother angry. So Sarah could not understand this in any other way, but that there must be something wrong with Alicia. Alicia's father would offer her kindness if it was just the two of them. But when her mother began railing against Alicia's disrespectful ways, then her father was nowhere to be found. Alicia knew not to complain to him about how her mother treated her. Her mother had all of the authority in the family, and he did not have what it took to stand up to her. The scapegoat child as the narcissistic parent's enemy. So a narcissistic parent may put a child into the role of enemy, and I'll refer to the child in this role as the scapegoat. This child pays for the narcissistic parent's sins by having to think, feel, and act as though they are the sinner. The parent unloads their own unbearable sense of inferiority onto the scapegoat child. You might wonder how a parent can get a child to believe such a lie. Well, there can be an insidious psychological process at the heart of this dynamic that explains how the narcissistic parent enforces these roles. Such a parent can engage in a subtle yet powerful psychological maneuver to find the worthlessness they can't stand in themselves in their scapegoat child. And this is a process known as pathological projective identification. Projective identification isn't always pathological. It can happen when relational communication needs to happen without language. So imagine a dog who makes eye contact with his owners, then turns around and deliberately trots away while the dog's keeping their eyes locked on the owner as if that owner were about to give chase. The owner finds himself in a sudden playful state and in fact does give chase. Well, projective identification becomes pathological or harmful when used to coerce others into thinking, feeling, and acting in ways that are in only one party's self-interest. And of course, this is what happens when a narcissistic parent engages in this process with their scapegoat child. First, the parent unconsciously registers the unbearable threat of feeling worthless. Next, they unconsciously relocate or project these feelings onto their child. That is, they see their child as the worthless one. The parent is now consciously convinced that it is their child who is worthless. The job isn't done, however. The parent needs the scapegoat child to think, feel, and act as though they are worthless. Only then can the parent be fully convinced that they are not the worthless one anymore. A narcissistic parent will devalue, deprive, and domineer, remember the 3 Ds, their scapegoat child to convince the two of them of that child's worthlessness. The child's dependence on the parent makes them vulnerable to assuming responsibility for this treatment. In other words, the child concludes that mom or dad would not treat them so poorly if the child did not deserve it. Now, the child mistakes their narcissistic parent's feelings of worthlessness as their own. So the parent insists they are correct about the worthlessness they see in their scapegoat child. Pathological projective identification happens when someone is terrified of the feeling that they are displacing onto the other person. So the parent must be right about that feeling belonging to the child because the alternative seems unsurvivable. As a prominent psychoanalyst named Jonathan Ogden succinctly puts it, the narcissistic parent's logic goes something like this. And this is a quote, "I can only see in you what I put there. And so if I don't see that in you, I see nothing." Let's go back to Alicia to further illustrate. Her mother lived with a nagging yet terrifying sense that she was not worth anything. She knew from an early age that the only way to deal with this feeling when it came up was to deny it. As she grew up, she found that she felt better when she could hate someone else more than herself. She'd find ways to gang up against kids in her class at school. Being naturally charismatic, she could influence other cool kids to follow her lead in putting down the uncool kids. She would talk about these kids and mock them. Each time she did this, she felt a little more buffered from that nagging worthlessness within. After a while, this became Alicia's mother's main way to keep herself functioning. She needed someone in her life whom she could look down upon so that she was spared. You might wonder why the knowledge that she was hurting others' feelings did not stop her from using them in this way. As a pathological narcissist, she was devoid of emotional empathy. Sure, she could use her mind to put herself in others' shoes, but she could not care about what others were experiencing in those shoes. Alicia's life was a steady stream of the 3 Ds, the devaluation, deprivation, and domineering from her mother. And her mother saw in Alicia the worthlessness she couldn't stand in herself. Now, her mother could take out all of the fear and anger she had at herself for feeling this way on Alicia. Not only was Alicia supposedly deserving of her mother's 3 Ds, but treating her this way helped her mother feel like she had control over that worthless feeling that felt uncontrollable when it was within her. Here's a typical snapshot of how Alicia's mother would relocate these feelings into Alicia and then coerce Alicia to see them as her own. So Alicia found math to be her most difficult subject in high school. She was a driven student and decided she would spend extra time after school studying with her teachers so that she could get better at it. Her mother yelled at her for being lazy and irresponsible, in other words, devalued her, when Alicia brought home a C- on her last math test. After 5 weeks of putting in this extra time, though, Alicia took another test. This time, she got a B+ and couldn't wait to show it to her mother. When she got home, Alicia took her test and pinned it to the refrigerator door. Later, her mother came in the kitchen and saw this. Her mother's stomach actually, though, dropped, and she felt a surge of shame and then a deluge of scorn towards Alicia. Her mother had many goals of her own, but could never seem to sustain the discipline and concentration to accomplish them. Seeing Alicia do this evoked her own sense of inadequacy, and she was going to have to discredit Alicia's accomplishment in order to feel better about herself. This was all decided unconsciously by her mother. All she saw consciously was that Alicia had put her test up on the refrigerator and committed the offense of leaving her book bag on the floor in the living room. Her mother thought to herself, "Alicia knows that I expect her to keep that bag in her room." Then she thought, "I'm going to teach that little ingrate a lesson." "Alicia," her mother shrieked. Alicia knew that when her mother said her name with such contempt and in such a loud voice that she was in for it. She braced herself for wrath as she walked into the kitchen where she saw her mother holding her book bag. Her mother barked, "What is this, huh? I asked you to put your book bag in your room and you just threw it in the living room today. Honestly, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you, Alicia. You are just so disrespectful and selfish. I can't even look at you anymore. Go up to your room until I tell you to come back down. Alicia felt agonized and ashamed. Being the object of her mother's wrath made her want to crawl out of her skin. Her accomplishment in math class became a long-distant memory in this moment. She walked up the stairs feeling like her insides had just been removed. She collapsed on her bed and said to herself, "I hate you. Why do you mess everything up?" As she did this, her eyes welled with tears and she forced herself to fall asleep just so that she could get away from these feelings. Why the scapegoat child must adopt their assigned role? Well, there are two reasons the scapegoat child must participate in the parent's use of pathological projective identification. First, the child must be able to share reality with their parent. If they can't, then they risk feeling like they are nobody to no one. To be somebody to someone, a child must find themselves in their parent's mind. The scapegoat child only finds a worthless version of themselves in their parent's mind. So this child must see themselves the same way. It's far better to be an inferior somebody to a superior someone than to be nobody to no one. And a child must also comply with their parent's pathological projective identification, or in other words, be who the parent is treating them as, because doing so allows them to survive feeling unlovable and incapable of loving others. Children need to believe that their parent can love them for the unique person that they are. That is not what a scapegoat child feels from their narcissistic parent. Instead, they're told they are unacceptable as they are. So this leaves the child dangerously close to feeling hopelessly unlovable. Children also need to know that the love they offer their parent is valuable. Instead, the scapegoat child's narcissistic parent acts as if nothing the child offers them is worthy of the parent's esteem. This leaves the child, again, dangerously close to feeling like they have nothing to offer that will keep the people they need close to them. If the child concluded either outcome, they could psychologically collapse into hopeless despair. The scapegoat child spares themselves this collapse by staying psychologically close to the same parent who is rejecting them. Being who the narcissistic parent's projective identification says the child is lets the child share a reality with the parent. And sharing a reality lets the child maintain two hopes. First is the hope that although they are not lovable now to the parent, that they can eventually become so if they can just fix themselves. Second is the hope that although they are supposedly too needy, selfish, or inconsiderate to offer love that is valued, they can change these things about themselves and eventually love their parent in a way the parent values. After episodes like the math test kept happening, Alicia found herself living on shaky footing in her world. She began to think that everything she does is wrong, that she is always in need of correction by another if she's to do anything right. She surrounded herself with friends who always made her the butt of the joke. They would mock her mannerisms in a way that seemed like it was supposed to be funny, but felt mean to Alicia. However, she dared not protest any of this treatment. Something within exerted pressure that said she had to stay this way. The scapegoat child's solution: mute themselves. The scapegoat child learns in traumatic fashion that pursuing their own developmental needs for connection and independence land them outside of the parent's reality. As I stated, the only acceptable reality for the narcissistic parent is one where they have all the worth and the scapegoat child has none. If this child seeks and finds connection with others, then they can easily conclude that they do have worth. This conflicts with the devalued way the parent needs to see the child, and by extension, how that child needs to see themselves. Similarly, if the child seeks more independence, then the narcissistic parent's need to domineer them could be thwarted. So to share in the parent's reality, they must be powerless and allow the parent to be powerful. When children promote their own development, they are programmed to see their parent as an available support for their own purposes. But instead, the scapegoat child finds no such support. They learn that they have supposedly committed a grave offense against the parent. The child, say, who is learning to walk and wants to walk further down the hallway than they ever have before, would want a parent to notice and appreciate their efforts. The scapegoat child's attempt in this scenario would leave them unfollowed by the parent and in a literal and figurative state of being all alone. These outcomes severely dampen the child's motivation to pursue their own developmental trajectory. So the scapegoat child has to adopt a solution that dissuades them from pursuing their healthy developmental goals of connection and independence. They know from experience that such pursuit will end in feeling ashamed and terrified. So the child mutes themselves. They stop listening to what they want and do not want. They cast doubt upon their own perceptions. They question their own judgment. They assume that if they say what they really think, then they will offend the people they need. They become especially wary of their own anger. This emotion seems way too destructive to even approach in themselves. They force themselves to be happy with whatever their parent offers them. They tell themselves that they are selfish if they are not happy with their parents' offerings. They see other kids as having more of a right to speak up than they do. They feel embarrassed before and after they do speak. They are terrified of feelings of pride. They assume that showing off is a bad thing. And they caution themselves from liking and showing who they are in the world. Muting happens unconsciously. It is so imperative to maintain a relationship with their narcissistic parent that their minds do not let them have a say in whether they will mute. Adult scapegoat survivors rarely point to a time where they decided to mute themselves. It's typically just the way things have been for as long as they can remember. If we could somehow plumb the unconscious of the scapegoat child to see what gives rise to their muted existence, we would find some beliefs. The child would have formed internal beliefs that they are defective and undeserving in one way or another. And these beliefs might sound like this: if I think well of myself, then I will have no one. If I think well of myself, I am provoking others to attack me. If I think well of myself, I will hurt those I need. I am physically disgusting. If I'm not being productive, then I'm worthless. If I express anger, then I'll be rejected. I don't deserve protection, and I am selfish. Each one of these beliefs either convinces the child that they do not have a right to pursue their developmental needs, or that they are just too messed up to do so successfully. Well, let's go back to Alicia. She found that her strivings towards being a good student, a good friend, and a good athlete in school were completely unsupported in her family. Either what she wanted didn't matter, or they treated it like it was an offensive act on her part. Over time, she had to stop listening to her own ambitions and desires. They just led to conflict and ultimately shame for her. Alicia began to withdraw from her social life at school. She grew to feel uneasy with how her classmates seemed to like her. They'd smile when she walked up to them and show excitement that she had appeared. She wondered what they might be up to. When she couldn't find anything in her mind as she thought about this, she decided that they must not really know how bad she is. They must be reacting to some fake version of her. So what value does their appreciation for her really hold? While Alicia was muted in her own energies, desires, and ambitions, she had to turn the volume way up on the needs of others. She scanned her environment at all times to see if someone might be unhappy with her. If she detected that they were, in even the slightest measure, she'd spring into action. She might present herself as lowly and in need of their guidance. This tended to make her mother feel superior or better, and often forget why she might be upset with Alicia. And Alicia could only feel happy if she had made someone else happy first. Life had to be lived through the eyes of others. These others somehow did not have to mute themselves like she did, and she could not question this arrangement. The need to unmute. Well, I'm going to read a quote from Abraham Maslow, the guy who made the pyramid and all about self-actualization. A musician must make music. An artist must paint. A poet must write if he is to be ultimately at peace with himself. What a man can be, he must be. Well, this guy Maslow emphasized our inner drive to become who we are meant to be. When that drive gets frustrated, we suffer. People who endured childhood as the scapegoat to a narcissistic parent do suffer in this way. Being who we can be cannot happen in a vacuum. In order for our being to feel real, it must be received and acknowledged by others. The narcissistic parent denies their scapegoat child of this experience. Instead of the child getting to know that their unique existence matters and deserves expression, they learn the opposite. In my work with scapegoat survivors, I have found that one of the most universally painful aspects is feeling thwarted from reaching their unique potentials. Put another way, when you cannot announce who you really are and what you really want, it's impossible to go after it. Although the relationship with the narcissistic parent is fixed by muting, the scapegoat child is left without a necessary inner compass in the rest of their lives. They must look outward instead of inward for direction. Their inner lives can feel dangerous and uncomfortable to explore. As a result, they must go to great lengths to avoid keeping themselves company. In our day and age, this can take the form of compulsive phone scrolling, TV watching, video game playing, or any other activity done at an intense enough level to distract them from what they think, feel, and want. When we are not being who we can be, then life can even feel meaningless. Scapegoat survivors may wonder what the point of their existence is if they do not feel like the author of it. This points to an existential agitation that comes over us when we have to deny our voices to ourselves and to others. It's this ongoing discomfort with not being able to be who you can be that leads many scapegoat survivors to seek change. Unmuting yourself today. Well, in my personal and professional experience, I've created 3 pillars of recovery that work for scapegoat survivors to unmute themselves starting today. These pillars or principles combat the ways your narcissistic parent devalued, deprived, and domineered you. And these pillars do so by helping you cultivate compassion, protection, and freedom in your life. Each of these pillars helps you structure your life in ways that promote unmuting yourself now. And let me show you how. So pillar number 1 is find compassion for yourself by making sense of what happened. As a scapegoat child, you had to accept your parents' devaluing treatment. Now, when you think of yourself in any situation, you may quickly and convincingly find yourself at fault while excusing or exonerating others. You may have had to devalue yourself in thought and feeling to stay in your parents' reality. And you may have had no other frame of reference to understand yourself from. This pillar teaches the dynamics of narcissistic abuse and scapegoating. You get to build a new compassionate frame of reference for who you are. And by learning about the psychology of pathological narcissism, you see how your parents' devaluation of you was unjustified. You'll see how you had to feel value less so that your parent could artificially inflate theirs. In short, you'll understand that there were forces way outside of your control that were acting upon you. Now the question will go from what's wrong with me to how did I survive a family system that was so wrong and abusive? The latter question ushers in admiration and respect for doing what you had to do to be here today. Well, in the movie The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and her crew, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and I know I'm forgetting someone, but anyway, initially fear the seemingly all-powerful wizard, the Wizard of Oz. And that is until they discover it's just a guy behind a curtain using smoke and mirrors to make him seem bigger and scarier than he is. This pillar helps you see behind the curtain of your narcissistic parent. And once you see this, you cannot go back to how it once was. The former wizard's accusations that you were defective and undeserving cannot hold the same importance. You see how these accusations were ways they kept themselves puffed up and had very little to do with you. And with this new understanding of your parent and yourself, you can unmute the thoughts about how unfairly you were treated. Now there's a justification to see yourself as the hero in your own life story. In doing so, you get to take your own side. Pillar number 2, protect yourself by gaining distance from narcissistic abusers today. In order to unmute today, you need to surround yourself with people who want to hear from you. As a scapegoat child, you were deprived of the healthy and safe relationships needed to safely unmute. You were also deprived of the protection needed to guard yourself from relationships that required you to mute. This pillar teaches you how to clear your life of people who expect you to stay muted. In so doing, you get to practice what it feels like to protect yourself. This pillar combats the deprivation of protection which you faced as the scapegoat child to your narcissistic parent. Pillar number 3, Free yourself by defying the narcissist's rules. Well, staying in your narcissistic parent's reality meant muting your free will. Knowing and doing what you wanted conflicted with your parents' need to domineer you. This pillar teaches you how to notice when the old rules that you be controlled by others show up in your life today. Next, you will learn how to deliberately and gradually see yourself as the center of your own initiative rather than someone else having to be the center. Scapegoat survivors have learned they must only react to important others. It's been forbidden to be the initiator in relationships. Listening to yourself first rather than reading the needs of others first can be initially terrifying. Your system may be all too primed to expect retaliation, rejection, and abandonment. This pillar helps you gain experience that acting on your own initiative no longer puts you in danger. And I just want to mention, if you want a low-cost option to understand and apply these 3 pillars of recovery in your own life, then I suggest checking out my Rise and Reclaim Healing Toolkit for Scapegoat Survivors. In it, you'll receive my book called Growing Up as a Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. And this book is a comprehensive and in-depth guide to these 3 pillars of recovery. If you're a scapegoat survivor, I think you'll find a lot of your own experience in these pages. Most importantly, you'll see how to apply these 3 pillars so that you can reclaim the quality of life that you deserve. And in this toolkit, you'll also get a worksheet that asks you to brainstorm ways to apply the pillars on a monthly ongoing basis. And you can find the link to the toolkit in the description box below. Well, that concludes today's video. I'm excited to introduce this new theme of having had to mute, and that recovery from narcissistic abuse as a scapegoat child involves gradually learning it's now safe to unmute. And in the videos in the foreseeable future, I'm going to link them to this notion of either why we had to mute in the first place and or how one can effectively unmute today. So I guess that's sort of a coming attraction. And with that, I want to again thank everyone for your support of this channel and the resources around it, and of each other, particularly in the comments section. And I look forward to posting a new video next Friday. Take care.